There was a moment here in Australia, when the wind seemed to whisper more than simply breeze. Not the wind off a resort beach where the umbrellas are color-coded and the coffee costs $12 and the view is technically free but everything surrounding it has been priced accordingly. The wind off a beach that most Australians have never heard of. A beach at the end of a road that gets quieter the further you go. A beach where the water is the color that water is supposed to be, where the sand goes further than you can walk in an afternoon, and where the town behind the dunes has a median rent that makes people who live in Sydney feel something between disbelief and a specific kind of grief for the years they spent paying what they paid. There are beach towns in Australia that the rest of the country has forgotten about. Not the famous ones. Not the ones in the holiday brochures or the ones that appear in property investment podcasts or the ones where the weekenders have driven up the prices until the locals can no longer afford to live where they grew up. The ones so genuinely affordable, so unexpectedly beautiful, so completely off the map of mainstream Australian coastal ambition that the question of what it would cost to live there produces numbers that feel like errors. We are counting down 7 of the cheapest beach towns in Australia you have probably never heard of. Some have median rents under $400 a week for a house, not a studio, not a room in a share situation, a house, within walking distance of a beach that would be internationally famous if anyone knew it existed. Some have housing prices so far below the national median that buying property there with what most city renters spend annually on rent is not a thought experiment but a genuine calculation. And one town has a beach so remote and so extraordinary that the handful of people who live there describe the experience of being a local with the specific reverence that people use for things they know are rare and know will not last. One town has dolphins in the river that runs beside the main street. Another has a lighthouse you can see from your kitchen window if your kitchen window faces the right direction, which most of them do because the town is small enough that orientation matters less than you would think. And yes, one place has a beach that stretches for over 30 kilometers in one direction and has, at its northern end, a permanent community of around 200 people who are living on one of the great stretches of coastline in the southern hemisphere for less than most city dwellers spend on rent alone. Think you know Australia's affordable coastline? Let's find out if you are ready for beach towns where the water is extraordinary and the price is the thing that makes you sit down and recalculate everything you thought you knew about the relationship between beauty and cost in this country. Like this video if you have ever stood on a beach and thought that this should not be this beautiful and this affordable and this unknown, and felt the particular dissonance of something that seems too good to be available. Subscribe because one day you will want to find the beach town that nobody else has found yet. And this channel is your guide to the stretches of Australian coastline where that is still possible. Let's break it down. Number 7. Coffin Bay, South Australia. Coffin Bay sits at the tip of the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia, a town of around 600 permanent residents on a peninsula that juts into the waters of the Great Australian Bight, and it produces oysters that are served in the finest restaurants in the country while the town itself remains so genuinely unassuming that most of the people eating those oysters in Sydney and Melbourne have no clear idea where they come from. The name comes from Sir Isaac Coffin, a British naval officer commemorated by Matthew Flinders during his 1802 circumnavigation. The town itself is built around the oyster industry and the national park that surrounds it. Coffin Bay National Park covers over 30,000 hectares of coastal wilderness, dune systems, and beaches that require a four-wheel drive to reach and reward the effort with the specific satisfaction of a beach that you have, for all practical purposes, entirely to yourself. Here is what living in Coffin Bay actually costs. Median house prices sit between $280,000 and $380,000. Well below the national median and dramatically below any comparable coastal location in Victoria or New South Wales. Rental properties are limited because the market is small, but when available run between $280 and $360 per week. The cost of living is around 20% below the national average. Port Lincoln, with full hospital services, a supermarket, and regional amenities, is 50 kilometers away and services the entire tip of the Eyre Peninsula. The oyster culture in Coffin Bay is not incidental, it is the economy. The leases in the bay produce some of the most sought-after oysters in Australia. The water clarity that makes this possible is visible from the shore. You can see the bottom at depths that surprise visitors who have spent their coastal lives on the murkier waters of the East Coast. The Coffin Bay National Park beaches, Point Avoid, Yangi Bay, Almonte Beach, are accessible by four-wheel drive and deliver the experience of a wilderness beach with no development and no other people on a scale that is genuinely extraordinary. One couple who moved from Adelaide wrote, "We came for a weekend to eat oysters and look at the water. We drove back to Adelaide and listed our house that week. People thought we had made a dramatic decision. We thought we had made an obvious one. The water was that color and the oysters were that good and the house cost a third of what our Adelaide house cost. The trade-off is the smallness. 600 people is a community where you know everyone's situation whether you intended to or not, and the distance from services beyond what Port Lincoln provides. Specialist medical care, major shopping, and cultural amenities require travel to Adelaide, which is 6 hours by road or a short flight. Picture this. It is an early morning in Coffin Bay. You drive into the national park before the day gets warm. The track ends at a beach with no name on most maps. The water is green and clear and the bottom is visible at 3 meters. You are the only person here. An oyster lease floats in the middle distance, producing the thing that people in cities pay $30 each for. Your house in town cost $290,000. This beach is 20 minutes from your front door. Nobody else is here because nobody else knows this is available. Number 6. Bremer Bay, Western Australia. Bremer Bay sits on the south coast of Western Australia, 5 hours east of Perth and about as far from the nearest city as a town can be while still maintaining the infrastructure of a functioning community. Population around 400 permanent residents, a number that swells dramatically in summer when the whales arrive. Bremer Bay is the site of one of the great whale aggregations in Australian waters, where sperm whales, orca, and various other species gather in the deep water canyon offshore in numbers that have made the area significant to marine biologists and almost entirely unknown to everyone else. The beaches at Bremer Bay Beach itself, the beaches of the Fitzgerald River National Park to the east, are the kind of coastline that appears in photographs that people assume are from somewhere in the Maldives or the Seychelles and then discover is 4 hours from Perth. The water in the protected bay is genuinely turquoise. The Fitzgerald River National Park, which begins at the edge of town, is a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve containing more plant species than the British Isles and a coastline of extraordinary ruggedness that is almost entirely unvisited. Here is the financial reality of Bremer Bay. Median house prices sit between $210,000 and $300,000 for properties in and around the town, with some older stock available below $200,000. Rental properties are scarce because the market is tiny, but when available run between $240 and $320 per week. The cost of goods is higher than the city because of the distance from supply chains, but housing costs dramatically compensate. Esperance, with a hospital and full services, is 2 hours east. The orca. This needs to be said directly. Between January and April each year, orca hunt in the deep water canyon 12 kilometers offshore from Bremer Bay in concentrations that have no equivalent on the south coast of Australia. The aggregation was only documented scientifically in the 2000s and the whale watching industry that has grown around it is still small enough that residents of the town can access it easily without the crowds that follow established wildlife tourism. Living in Bremer Bay means having access to this as a seasonal fact of the local calendar rather than a once-in-a-lifetime excursion. One retiree who moved from Perth wrote, "I paid $220,000 for a house in Bremer Bay. I watch orca from a boat every January. The beach in front of the town is turquoise in a way I did not believe was possible in Western Australia before I saw it. I have been here 4 years and I have not once felt that I made the wrong decision. My friends in Perth pay more per week in rent than I paid per year in rates. The trade-off is the genuine remoteness. Bremer Bay is 5 hours from Perth and 2 hours from the nearest town of any size. And the very limited local services, which means that anything beyond the basics requires a drive that most city dwellers would consider significant. Picture this. It is January. You are on a boat 12 kilometers offshore from Bremer Bay. The orca have been here for 3 weeks. They are hunting today, the water is active and the dorsal fins are everywhere, and the sound of it carries across the water in a way that the word extraordinary does not adequately describe. Your house in town cost $220,000. This is your local wildlife. This is your January. Number 5. Beachport, South Australia. Beachport sits on the limestone coast of South Australia, 300 kilometers southeast of Adelaide near the Victorian border, and it is the kind of town that Australians who have been there describe with the specific enthusiasm of people who have found something and are not entirely sure they want anyone else to find it too. Population around 450 permanent residents. The town sits on a peninsula between the Southern Ocean and Lake George, which gives it the unusual quality of having water on 3 sides, Ocean Beach on one side, lake on the other, and the town occupying the narrow strip of land between them. The main beach, protected by a long breakwater, is calm enough for families. The ocean beaches outside the protection of the bay are the kind of long, wild, Southern Ocean coastline that stretches for kilometers without a structure of any kind. Here is what Beachport costs. Median house prices sit between $220,000 and $310,000, with some properties under $200,000 in the older parts of town. Rental accommodation runs between $220 and $310 per week when available. The cost of living is around 22% below the national average. Mount Gambier, with a full base hospital, university, and comprehensive regional services, is 100 kilometers north. The rock lobster industry sustains the town economically and keeps the culture genuinely connected to the sea. The fishermen here are not a tourism feature. They are the people at the general store and the pub and the school, and their knowledge of the local water is the knowledge of people who work in it every day. The Pool of Siloam, a small saltwater lake at the edge of town with a salt concentration 8 times that of seawater, allows effortless floating in a setting that has no equivalent on the limestone coast. One family who relocated from Adelaide wrote, "We bought a house in Beachport for $240,000. It has a view of Lake George from the back and is 7 minutes walk from the ocean beach. We moved from a suburb where that budget would not have bought us a garage. Our children swim in the lake after school. We fish on weekends. I have to remind myself regularly that this is our actual life. The trade-off is the smallness and the distance. 450 people is small enough that new arrivals are significant events, and Mount Gambier is an hour away for anything beyond local services. The Southern Ocean winter brings genuine cold and wind that requires adjustment for people moving from warmer climates. Picture this. It is an afternoon in autumn. You walk from the ocean beach across the narrow strip of town to the edge of Lake George. The light is low and coming across the water at the angle that autumn light arrives in the south. The salt lake is still. The ocean is audible on the other side of the dunes. Your house is 3 minutes behind you. It cost $240,000 and has water views on 2 sides. This is Tuesday. This is your life. Number 4. Hopetown, Western Australia. Hopetown sits in the Shire of Ravensthorpe on the south coast of Western Australia, population around 500 people, and it is the gateway to the Cape Arid and Fitzgerald River National Parks, 2 of the most botanically extraordinary protected areas in Australia, containing plant species that exist nowhere else on Earth and coastline that has no development for hundreds of kilometers in either direction. The town is small but functional. It has a supermarket, a pub, a medical center, a school, and the basic infrastructure of a community that has decided to be permanent about its situation. The beach in front of the town is protected and calm. The beaches accessible from the national parks to the east and west are the kind of undeveloped Southern Ocean coastline that requires commitment to reach and rewards that commitment with the specific experience of a beach that has not been organized for your convenience and is more beautiful for it. Here is the financial picture. Median house prices sit between $170,000 and $260,000. Among the lowest coastal prices in Western Australia for a town with this quality of environment. Rental accommodation is limited but runs between $190 and $280 per week. The cost of living is around 18% below the national average for essentials. Esperance, with a hospital and full services, is 190 kilometers west. The wildflower season in the surrounding region, from August to October, transforms the landscape into something that serious botanists travel from overseas to see. The heathlands behind Hopetown contain Banksia, Hakea, Grevillea, and hundreds of other species in concentrations and diversities that have no equivalent on the south coast. Residents experience this as a seasonal fact of the local year rather than a destination experience. One artist who moved from Melbourne wrote, "I paid $185,000 for a house in Hopetown. My studio is in a converted shed on the same block. The light on the south coast is the light that I came to Western Australia to find, and Hopetown has it every morning. My cost of living is so far below what I paid in Melbourne that the first year I kept checking my bank account expecting a mistake. The trade-off is genuine remoteness from city services. Esperance is almost 2 hours west and Perth is over 6 hours. And the very small community which, at 500 people, has the specific social texture of places where everyone knows your situation in detail. Picture this. It is a morning in September. The heathlands behind Hopetown are flowering. You drive 20 minutes into the Fitzgerald River National Park and stop at a beach that has no name on the tourist maps. The South Coast light is the light that painters talk about. Your house cost $185,000. The wildflowers are doing what they do every year and nobody in Melbourne knows this is happening and you live here. Number 3. Ceduna, South Australia. Ceduna sits at the head of the Great Australian Bight on the far west coast of South Australia, population around 3,500 people, and it is the last significant town before the Nullarbor. The last place with a supermarket and a hospital and a functioning main street before the road goes into one of the world's great empty stretches and does not find another town for hours. This position, at the edge of the Nullarbor, at the beginning of the Great Australian Bight, at the convergence of the Southern Ocean and the outback, gives Ceduna a quality that is unusual on this list. It is not merely a coastal town. It is a coastal town at the end of something, and the ocean here has the specific weight of an ocean that has nothing between it and Antarctica. Here is what living in Ceduna costs. Median house prices sit between $140,000 and $200,000, some of the lowest coastal prices in South Australia. Rental accommodation runs between $160 and $240 per week. The cost of living is around 25% below the national average for housing. The hospital in Ceduna covers general needs. Specialist services require travel to Port Augusta or Adelaide. The surfing at Cactus Beach, 40 kilometers south of Ceduna, is among the most legendary in Australia. A right-hand point break that has been producing extraordinary waves for decades and that appears in surf films and surf photography as one of the defining locations of Australian surfing culture. Residents of Ceduna drive to Cactus on weekday mornings when the swell is running and surf breaks that professionals travel from overseas to ride, in conditions of near-complete privacy. The Great Australian Bight is the context. The southern right whales that gather in the bight between June and October to calve do so in sight of the cliffs in numbers that have been increasing as the population recovers. Head of the bight, 200 kilometers west of Ceduna, is the primary viewing point, but the whales are visible from coastal locations throughout the region during the season. One surfer who moved from Sydney wrote, "I pay $190 a week for a house 3 kilometers from the main beach in Ceduna. I drive to Cactus when the swell is good, which is often. I have surfed waves there that I would have queued for hours to access in Sydney. There was nobody else in the water. There is almost never anyone else in the water. I have been here 3 years and I have not once regretted the decision." The trade-off is the genuine remoteness of the far west coast of South Australia. Ceduna is 10 hours from Adelaide by road, and the limited services for a town of its size. The community has social challenges that are visible and real and that require honest acknowledgement when considering relocation. Picture this. It is a morning in July. A southern right whale is in the bight below the cliffs east of Siduna. The whale is doing what southern right whales do when they arrive in the bight in July, which is be enormous and present and completely unhurried. Your house in town costs $175,000. The swell at Cactus is running. The whale does not know or care about any of this and is making the correct decisions accordingly. Number 2. Shark Bay, Western Australia. Shark Bay sits at the most westerly point of Australia, a World Heritage-listed marine area where the stromatolites at Hamelin Pool are the oldest living organisms on Earth, where the dolphins at Monkey Mia have been interacting with humans for over 50 years, and where the water in the turquoise shallows of the bay is the color that people who have seen it remember for the rest of their lives. The community of Denham, the main settlement in the Shark Bay region, has a population of around 900 people and sits on a peninsula with the Indian Ocean on one side and the protected waters of the bay on the other. The road to Shark Bay from the Northwest Coastal Highway is 830 kilometers north of Perth, which is far enough that the journey itself filters out all but the most committed visitors and creates, for the people who live here, the specific freedom of a place that cannot be reached casually. Here is what living in Denham costs. Median house prices sit between $250,000 and $380,000. Rental accommodation runs between $260 and $360 per week. The cost of goods is higher than the city because of the supply chain distance, but housing compensates significantly. Carnarvon, with a hospital and regional services, is 250 kilometers north. The stromatolites at Hamelin Pool are the oldest living things that most people will ever stand next to, layered columns of cyanobacteria that have been building themselves for 3.5 billion years and that are responsible, in a very direct sense, for the oxygen in the atmosphere that makes the rest of life possible. Residents of Denham drive to Hamelin Pool the way people in other towns drive to the local beach. The dolphins at Monkey Mia. Wild dolphins that choose to come to the shallow water each morning and interact with the ranger program, are 15 minutes from the center of town. One marine researcher who took a position in the region wrote, "I came for the work and stayed because of where the work is." The bay is World Heritage for reasons that are visible every time you go into the water. The stromatolites are 3.5 billion years old. The dolphins come in every morning. I pay $280 a week for a house with a view of the bay. I have been offered positions in the city twice and turned them down twice. The bay is the reason. The trade-off is the significant distance from the city and from specialist services, the higher cost of goods, and the very small community which at 900 people has the specific dynamics of a place where everyone is known and where the space between people is both physical and social. Picture this. It is a morning at Monkey Mia. The dolphins have come in from the bay in the way they come in every morning, unhurried, choosing, arriving at the shallows because they choose to and not because anything compels them. The ranger program is managing the interaction with the care of something that has been happening here for over 50 years. Your house is 15 minutes away and costs $260,000. The Indian Ocean is outside your window on one side and the protected bay on the other, and the oldest living things on Earth are 40 minutes south, and this is where you live. Number 1. Esperance, Western Australia. Esperance takes the top spot as the cheapest genuinely extraordinary beach town in Australia. Because Esperance has beaches that consistently appear on lists of the most beautiful in the world, has a median house price that sits below the national median by a margin that makes the comparison feel almost unfair, and has a community of 14,000 people that is large enough to provide real services and small enough to maintain the specific quality of a town that has not yet been discovered by the people who would change it. Esperance sits on the south coast of Western Australia, 700 kilometers southeast of Perth, and the beaches that surround it, Lucky Bay, Twilight Beach, 11 Mile Beach, West Beach, are beaches of white sand and turquoise water that have no equivalent on the Australian East Coast and that most East Coast Australians have never seen and will spend the rest of their lives not knowing they missed. Here is what Esperance actually costs. Median house prices sit between $350,000 and $480,000, well below the national median and dramatically below any comparable coastal location with this quality of beach in the country. Rental accommodation runs between $320 and $420 per week. The cost of living is around 14% below the national average. Esperance Hospital provides general services. Specialist care requires travel to Perth, which is an 8-hour drive or a 2-hour flight. Lucky Bay is the beach. Kangaroos sit on the sand at Lucky Bay in the way that wildlife in genuinely protected areas sits near people, with the complete absence of concern that comes from never having had a reason for concern. The sand at Lucky Bay is so white and so fine that it squeaks when you walk on it. The water is the specific turquoise that comes from clear shallow water over white sand, and it has no equivalent within 2,000 kilometers. Lucky Bay is 45 minutes from the center of Esperance, and it is what it is every day, not just on the days when the light cooperates. The Recherche Archipelago, over 100 islands stretching east from Esperance through the Southern Ocean, is accessible by boat and contains beaches, wildlife, and diving that the handful of people who have experienced it describe with the specific reverence of things they feel obligated to protect by not fully describing. The Cape Le Grand National Park, which contains Lucky Bay, is managed with the care of a place that understands what it has. One remote worker who relocated from Melbourne wrote, "I pay $380 a week for a house 6 minutes from Twilight Beach. I moved from a suburb in Melbourne where that budget bought me a room in a share house with no natural light. I work the same job. I earn the same salary. The beach is 6 minutes away. Kangaroos sit on the sand at Lucky Bay, and I go there on Tuesday mornings when I finish early and there is almost nobody there. I have been here 2 years and I still find it difficult to explain to people in Melbourne why I have not come back. The trade-off is the distance from Perth. 700 kilometers is a real distance that makes weekend trips to the city uncommon and makes specialist medical care something to plan for, and the cultural limitations of a regional city of 14,000 people where the arts, restaurant, and entertainment options are proportional to its size. Picture this. It is a Tuesday morning. You finish work at 10. You drive 45 minutes to Lucky Bay. A kangaroo is sitting on the sand at the waterline in the specific way that kangaroos sit on sand at Lucky Bay, as if this is obviously where kangaroos sit and always has been. The water is turquoise. The sand is white and squeaks under your feet. Nobody else is here yet. Your house in Esperance cost $380,000. You moved from Melbourne. This is your Tuesday morning. This is what Tuesday feels like now. And in that quiet hush, beneath the whispering gums, in the turquoise water and the white sand and the kangaroos on the beach and the orca offshore and the oysters in the bay and the dolphins that arrive each morning because they choose to, I realized not all shadows hide. Some simply invite us to see. We just counted down 7 of the cheapest beach towns in Australia you have probably never heard of. Some have housing prices that will make you question what you have been paying and why. Some have beaches that belong on any list of the most beautiful in the world and are not on those lists only because the people who make those lists have not been there. And all of them have something that the famous beach towns traded away a long time ago, the specific quality of a coastline that has not yet been converted entirely into a product. The prices are real. The distances are real. The trade-offs are real. But so is the possibility that somewhere on the south coast of Western Australia, on the tip of the Eyre Peninsula, at the edge of the Nullarbor, at the most westerly point of the continent, there is a beach and a town and a house at a price that changes what the rest of your life looks like. If this video showed you something worth seeing, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a different kind of map. We will see you in the next one. This video expresses poetic and reflective storytelling. Property prices and rental figures are based on publicly available information and may vary. Always conduct thorough research before making property or relocation decisions. It does not offer financial, legal, or real estate advice.